Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachersfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that because of political pressures, James Madison initially chose a man named Robert Smith to be his Secretary of State instead of his buddy Albert Gallatin, the sitting Secretary of the Treasury? That twice James Madison spoke too soon in his negotiations with Britain and France, telling the American public he had struck a major deal, only to find out it never actually happened. And that after a couple years of Robert Smith's incompetence, James Madison did what he really wanted to do, confront Smith and fire him, only to then turn to his old friend and more recently rival, James Monroe, to become the Secretary of State for the upcoming conflict with Britain. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 98, Madison's Trials and Errors. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 98. I am excited to dive into James Madison's presidency. Quick note, as you've probably realized by now, I try to have all the episodes out on either Wednesday morning or Thursday morning, depending on my work and family schedule and my producer Brian's schedule. But next week, I already know it probably won't be out until Friday. I'm on vacation starting Wednesday, and I'm out until next Wednesday, so I won't be home to record it until then. So next week, episode 99, expect it in your podcast feed, wherever you get your podcast, on a Friday. Also, Zach, Bill, and I are doing our episode 100 Q&A, but it will probably actually be episode 101. Episode 99 and 100 will likely be continuing with the narrative, and then episode 101 will be the Q&A, and that's also due to scheduling. Bill travels a lot, and Zach and I have some travel coming up too, so getting all three of us in a room at the same time is harder than it should be. So expect that in episode 101. Please be sure to send in any questions you have about, what we've talked about recently in history, any of the presidents we've covered, and, we'll answer your questions. We've gotten a handful so far, and we're looking forward to getting more. So let's dive into it. Last week, we finished up our narrative on Thomas Jefferson, said goodbye to a truly great American politician and a person. We then dug a bit deeper on Madison's role as Secretary of State and what types of challenges he was specifically dealing with, especially during Jefferson's second term. Today, we're going to take a closer look at Madison's first term as president, and specifically the first few years, and examine exactly what he was dealing with and why it was so difficult for him. As you can likely imagine, based off of Jefferson's second term and the headaches that Madison had to deal with regarding impressment from the British, as Madison entered office, he was primarily focused on foreign affairs and how he was going to navigate America's complicated relationship with both Britain and France. Knowing that both Britain and France each independently had laws that limited or excluded American shipping, Madison was hoping he would be able to potentially play Britain and France against one another, forcing them to retreat from their positions and allow American commerce to get back on track. So as we know, Madison had 8 years of experience as Secretary of State, and he believed he could more or less actually be his own Secretary of State, while he was also president. So, in that light, still pretty annoyed at how James Monroe ran against him as president, he didn't want to ask Monroe. So he wanted to ask Albert Gallatin, but that fell through. He ended up choosing a man named Robert Smith to serve as his Secretary of State. And as I mentioned in the lead into the show, at the end of this episode, we'll see James Madison fire Robert Smith and end up reaching out to James Monroe. Madison was inaugurated as the fourth president and second Democratic-Republican president of the United States on March 4th, 1809. His inauguration took place in the Capitol building that was still under construction at the time. In a final show of political humility, Thomas Jefferson declined Madison's invitation to ride to the inauguration in Madison's carriage, and instead rode on a horse amongst the rest of the people in attendance. Jefferson later claimed that this decision wasn't some desperate attempt to once again present false humility, but instead he was focused on taking the attention off of Madison. He did not want to ride in the carriage and have all the attention on him. He wanted Madison to bask in this moment. Madison had earned it. And you can understand that. If you're a listener of this podcast, then you know that the last two inaugurations of a new president were a bit overshadowed by the outgoing president. Right? When Adams was inaugurated in 1796, it was still the George Washington show. Adams talked about Washington during his speech. Washington stood right behind Adams as he spoke, and everyone was mourning the retirement of such a great man. The storyline of Adams becoming president was almost an afterthought to some, opposed to the discussion of the great George Washington's retirement. And then in the next election, the election of 1800, if you remember, Adams refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration. He headed out at about 4 a.m. that morning. While he claimed it was because he didn't want to draw attention to himself, by bailing at the last second, he only made it an even bigger storyline. Considering Thomas Jefferson was president for both of these events, it would make sense that he was a bit sensitive to the subject. And like I said, that's what Jefferson later claimed, writing that he, quote, "wished not to divide him the honors of the day. It pleased me better to see them all bestowed on him." Him being Madison in this instance. And of course, the irony in all of this is that Jefferson was so humble and so Republican that it was almost all anyone could talk about. Well, I mean, wasn't all they could talk about, because Madison, he got people talking too, because he wasn't really a very impressive guy, at least optically. One observant noticed that he seemed to, quote, tremble when he spoke. John Quincy Adams, who was present for the speech, couldn't even hear him, and writer Washington Irving said he looked like a, quote, withered little Applejohn. Clearly, Madison's reputation had preceded him, and even in his older age, he had not been able to master any public speaking presence. Madison's speech was focused primarily on the conflict between Britain and France and how both countries were blatantly violating neutral trade laws. He did not sugarcoat the issues that the U.S. was dealing with and reinforced his desire to govern through Republican principles of, quote, preserving the rights of conscience and free press, reducing the debt, and limiting the military. He acknowledged that militias were the bulwark of republics and commented how important they were to guaranteeing safety. He then asked his fellow citizens to, quote, supply my deficiencies. Similar to his acceptance of the role of Secretary of State in 1801, James Madison surely felt insecure about his new position. Throughout his career, he had proven himself to be brilliant, a true political maestro. But also throughout his entire career, he seemed to often have someone else executing on his ideas and doing the talking for him. Whether it was people speaking on his behalf at the Constitutional Convention or in the House of Representatives, or Thomas Jefferson maintaining his presence as the face of the Republican Party, while Madison was the one negotiating behind the scenes. Now, that doesn't mean that Madison did not get out and defend himself or speak publicly. He did, right? He got into numerous debates and things that we've covered in this podcast, but that wasn't his forte. It wasn't really what he liked to do. Now all of the attention was on him, and he was not only going to be responsible for coming up with policy and forming plans to deal with international conflicts, he was going to have to be the one to execute them. Madison also made sure to point out that he sought the presidency to help ensure Republican liberty in the United States of America and not some type of personal fulfillment, which at this time seemed to be an obligatory thing to say if you became president. You had to pretend like you didn't actually want to be president. As Madison entered the White House, he was accompanied by the former de facto First Lady, who had now made it official, his wife, Dolly. At the inaugural ball, this inaugural ball was packed, right? Madison was miserable, telling one guest that, quote, "I would much rather be in bed." But Dolly was soaking it all in. She was a social butterfly and a diplomatic master. She was dressed in a beautiful velvet gown and was donning a gorgeous pearl necklace, leading one observer to remark that she looked like a queen. For the next year or so, Dolly spent a lot of her time refashioning the president's residence. Considering Abigail Adams had little chance and didn't much care, and Jefferson was a widower, Dolly was really the first lady to have an opportunity and desire to put her stamp on the White House. And that she did. As I mentioned moments ago, Madison's focus when he entered the office of the presidency was almost primarily on the conflict between Britain and France and how it was affecting the United States. With that in mind, just a few days before his inauguration, Jefferson technically, passed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. This act was, I guess you could say it was a pretty shrewd political move, as it allowed the U.S. to maintain neutrality while also creating some pressure for Britain or France to act fairly quickly. The Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 stated that the embargo was over. American ships were free to trade now, but because of Britain and France's edicts, they were still forbidden to trade with both Britain and France, unless one of the two countries would lift their restrictions on American trade. Madison said that whichever one of these two countries lifted their restrictions on American trade first would not only trade with the U.S., but they would be an exclusive trade partner with the U.S. As I mentioned last week, Madison knew that without a powerful army or effective navy, American trade was really their greatest weapon in international politics. It was the carrot and the stick. This being said, Madison had privately mentioned how he didn't have a lot of confidence in this Non-Intercourse Act to accomplish much, but he didn't have much of a choice, as Jefferson so accurately reminded him that, quote, "No government would be so embarrassing in war as ours." Thanks to you, Mr. Jefferson. The cabinet that Madison filled out to help him tackle these challenges only made life more difficult. As I mentioned before, for Secretary of State, Madison's old job, he wanted to choose Albert Gallatin, the current Secretary of Treasury, and maybe even deep down wanted to choose James Monroe at this time, but couldn't bring himself to do it. So Gallatin was his number one choice. But with years of Gallatin knocking heads with the Federalists in Congress, they blocked the appointment. So instead, Madison settled for Robert Smith, the former Secretary of the Navy and the brother, and this is important, of the incredibly influential and powerful Congressman, Samuel Smith. This decision would end up being a huge mistake, and one that Madison would eventually correct. But this decision had short-term consequences, making Madison look like someone who was willing to settle, not to fight. It made him look too agreeable, not strong enough. People already had these perceptions of him, and he wasn't helping himself with this appointment. Now, this may not be fair, but it was the perception, and in a lot of ways, perception is reality. When James Monroe heard about this appointment, he was upset. He was hoping to be in Madison's cabinet and thought he could help if he served as Secretary of State. That being said, though, Monroe recognized that his campaign to challenge Madison for the presidency, the second time he has challenged his neighbor for a political office, made such magnanimity difficult. With the passing of the Non-Intercourse Act, Madison hoped that Britain would be open to such a negotiation, and he was right, sort of. While drawing up the Non-Intercourse Act, Britain's ambassador to the U.S., David Erskine, was planning to propose a similar plan. In April, Madison and Erskine struck a deal. Trade was back on with Britain, and Madison proved that economic coercion was, yes, the most effective tool for diplomatic success. He patted himself on the back and probably high-fived a bunch of people, and on May 23, 1809, he announced the agreement and took credit for it. He said that on June 10, 1809, trade with Britain would be reopened. In June, about 600 ships sailed from America to Britain, and all seemed well on the international stage. People were ecstatic. Church bells rang, parties in the street. Madison was widely praised by both his fans and critics alike. But not so fast. See, Madison had communicated this successful negotiation before he actually received word of the final stamp of approval. It's one thing to strike a deal with a 32-year-old ambassador. It's another thing to get King George to sign off on the deal. By the end of July, Madison received the terrible news. His deal with Erskine? Not approved. Britain had a change of heart. And actually, Britain claimed they never even had a change of heart in the first place, because they said Erskine went above and beyond what his instructions were. And they wanted everyone to know that. They actually published his instructions publicly so everyone could see that Erskine did not have the authority or permission to strike the deal that he and Madison had agreed to and Madison had made public. Britain decided to stand their ground and were planning on intercepting and seizing any American ships that sailed anywhere in Europe. The logic from Britain was this. They figured Napoleon needed these American ships a lot more than they did. Therefore, if they were the first to act on this deal that was proposed by Madison and start trade with the U.S. again, Napoleon would take notice and also open up trade to the U.S. And while the U.S. claimed that the first country to open up trade with them would have exclusivity, they likely weren't just going to turn down the opportunity to open up trade with another world superpower. Therefore, Britain believed upon further reflection that they had no choice but to draw an even harder line with the U.S. Another interesting tidbit about this entire negotiation was that when Madison wrote to Britain about the deal he and Erskine had struck, he included directions for King George to punish Admiral Barclay, the commander of the HMS Leopard that fired on the USS Chesapeake, something we talked about last week. I think we mentioned it in episode 96 too. Not only did Madison say this, but he also said that it was the honorable thing to do, implying that if King George did not do it, he would be proceeding in a dishonorable way. It doesn't take a political scholar to recognize the potential folly in not only telling King George what to do and how to do it, but also implying that his inaction, up to this point, was dishonorable. You may be wondering, why the heck would President Madison write this? Well, I'm not 100% sure, but historians have a guess. If you remember, when Madison was being challenged on his communications with Britain in the election of 1808, he provided total transparency and allowed Congress and the public to read his letters. It was a huge win for him and actually made Monroe look bad. Some historians think that Madison was proactively preparing for the same type of reveal in his future. He wanted to make sure he created a paper trail that made him look good. But in what was probably not the first time he had outthought himself, Madison made a mistake. Henry Adams, in his history of Madison's presidency, pointed out that this statement Madison included to King George was foolhardy, proclaiming that, quote, if Madison wished reconciliation, the words were useless. If he wished to quarrel, he chose the right means. Madison, in hindsight, even recognized his mistake. He had received word that the British ministry was considering the proposal, but his statement about Berkeley enraged the king and squashed the entire thing. Madison was jaded. He realized that his hope that British was open to true reconciliation was likely just a pipe dream. They did not seem to be genuinely interested in re-engaging their relationship with the U.S., and they proved it because they replaced Erskine with Francis Jackson, a man who was beyond obnoxious and resented pretty much all things America. The short relationship between Jackson and the U.S. was so bad that Madison eventually told Robert Smith to stop even speaking to him, as it was a waste of everyone's time. In August, Madison reversed his proclamation that had allowed trade with Britain. In what was his first major diplomatic action as president, Madison surely felt both embarrassed and exposed. On the other hand, though, this now put Madison maybe where he likely wanted to be. At least that's what Jefferson told him. Jefferson explained to him that since Britain reneged on their deal with the U.S., Madison can show the Federalists that he tried to reconcile with Britain. Additionally, Jefferson mused that when Napoleon eventually wisened up and reached out to the U.S., Madison and the Republicans could renew their alliance with France unimpeded. But it was not to be. Napoleon saw Britain and the U.S. at loggerheads, so instead of reaching out to the U.S., he doubled down, and in response to the Non-Intercourse Act, reaffirmed that all U.S. trade to Europe was still strictly prohibited. At this point, a re-engaging of trade with both countries was off, but the bigger problem was what to do with Britain. Madison could do nothing and allow Britain's insults to stand. He could try to once again enforce some type of economic sanction on them, or he could go to war. None of these options were particularly appealing. With this in mind, Madison took another shot at negotiation with Napoleon. In May 1810, Madison and Congress passed a bill after some debate back and forth, and the bill was called Macon's Bill No. 2. This bill basically told Napoleon that the U.S. intended to keep trading blockades be damned. If he were willing to lift his sanctions on the U.S. and open up trade again, the U.S. would then only trade with him and bar all trade with Britain, sort of repeating the original intention of the Non-Intercourse Act in some ways. At this time, this was a pretty innovative idea. The hope was that if they could get one nation to stand down, the other would follow. Brilliant, right? And that's what Britain assumed with the Non-Intercourse Act. But no one really knew. That was the problem. It could be genius or it could be completely stupid. They would find out. Knowing that Napoleon needed American trade more than Britain did, some in Congress were hopeful. In August, Madison received word that Napoleon was on board with the idea. Madison once again moved quickly. He tried to open up trade with France, and he gave Britain 90 days to do the same, or else Britain would basically be forfeiting their opportunity to trade with America. And this was one of the wrinkles in Macon's Bill No. 2 that made it unique. As Madison was waiting to hear back from Britain and France, he privately turned his attention toward Florida, because while at this point he had gotten word that Napoleon was on board with the idea, he, at least at first, felt like he needed some type of confirmation. France at this time was a bit busy. Napoleon was preoccupied. They were involved in the Peninsular War with Spain and Britain, and Madison thought that improving the relationship with Napoleon would not only help open up trade, but also make progress in Florida that much easier. In West Florida, there was land that the U.S. thought they should have received in the Louisiana Purchase, but they hadn't yet. Madison moved on Spain's preoccupation with France and began to recruit people to American sympathies and proclaim West Florida an independent territory that would subsequently be merged into the U.S. This was a bold act of power politics. West Florida was vulnerable, and Madison jumped at the opportunity to try to take control of it. After decades of Madison trying to justify, reason, and find evidence for different actions or stances, this was the first time that he just said, you know what, screw it, I'm doing it. He did what he wanted to do, and he thought it's what needed to be done. The executive seemed to be wearing off on him a bit. With Madison making some progress in West Florida, he turned his attention back toward Europe and found himself in a bit of a catch-22. More of a catch-22 than he expected with France and Britain. They were both being difficult. When Britain found out that Madison was wooing Napoleon and threatening to call off trade with them, they responded that they would lift trade restrictions after Napoleon did. The only problem is that Napoleon thought about it a bit more and told Madison that he would open up to a trading agreement as long as Britain lifted their blockade, their orders in council, or if America cut them off completely. So in essence, Napoleon said he would trade with the U.S. if Britain lifted their blockade, or if the U.S. wholly cut them off. Britain then responded that if Napoleon lifted his decrees, in which he basically had also restricted European trade, they would lift their blockade. The chicken and the egg. International politics handled by letter across oceans had to be infuriating sometimes. Napoleon was frustrated. He had told Madison and the U.S. that he would be open to lifting his decrees and allowing American trade. But since then, he had heard that if he did that, Britain would lift their blockade, which they also implied directly to Madison, which would open up American trade to Britain. So you can see why Britain and France and Madison are having so much trouble coming to an agreement. Because it was in Napoleon's best interest to keep the U.S. pissed off at Britain for as long as possible, while also in his best interest to find a way to facilitate desperately needed trade with the U.S. After the 90-day period was up, Madison officially cut off all trade with Britain. But now he was really stuck. See, he had told the nation publicly, prematurely, again, that he had negotiated diplomatic victory to reopen trade, this time with France, when that hadn't actually happened. Napoleon had made a promise, but then he thought about it more, clarified his promise, and still did nothing. Madison asked his Secretary of State Robert Smith to get a meeting with the French ambassador, and since Madison fancied himself as his own Secretary of State, he wrote out all of the talking points and a script for the seemingly incompetent Smith. Madison needed to know whether Napoleon actually did revoke the decrees or just partially. Since he had already announced publicly that they'd been revoked in full, I can somewhat see Madison's tone being something along the lines of, hey, Napoleon revoked those decrees in full, right? This is more or less what Robert Smith asked, and the ambassador's reply was a fancy French version of, yeah, not really sure, Napoleon's busy fighting a war over here. Let me check it out and I'll get back to you. It was at this point, I'm sure in many moments leading up to this, that Madison's concerns and insecurities about handling international relations and executing on them came rushing back to him. He looked foolish again. His ardent critic John Randolph described the negotiations as, quote, a bargain which credulity and imbecility enter into with cunning and power. If you remember from episode 97, Jefferson's appointment of Madison as Secretary of State ended up being a wise one. But Madison was concerned that he was an expert on domestic politics, not foreign politics, because that's where his experience was. But Jefferson wasn't worried about that, for he had decades of experience in international politics. While Madison was still regularly in contact with Jefferson as president from Jefferson's home in Monticello, he was likely beginning to feel like he was a bit on an island in these negotiations. He didn't trust his current Secretary of State, and his best friend, confidant, and the man who was actually making the final decisions in all of Madison's previous international negotiations, Thomas Jefferson, was kicking his feet up in Monticello and tending to his plantation. Madison was unmoored. He was a man who was still learning how to deal with these international questions while being expected to already know. Since becoming president for all intents and purposes, his own Secretary of State, too, Madison had announced a deal with Britain, then personally insulted King George and had the deal reneged. He was not patient enough to hear back from Britain, so he allowed hundreds of American ships to set sail illegally toward Europe under the assumption that it was legal, which it wasn't. Then Madison received a promise from Napoleon and made a similar mistake. He treated this promise like it was already in effect, announced it prematurely, and had to once again backtrack. It's at this point, I am sure, the U.S. is slowly losing confidence in Madison's ability to effectively participate in this game of international political chess. And in the end, both of these mistakes actually pushed the U.S. further from Britain. The first because he insulted King George, and the second because he announced a trade alliance with Napoleon and gave Britain an ultimatum simultaneously. To make things even worse for Madison, his own Secretary of State, Robert Smith, did not agree with how Madison was handling these political challenges, and really did not like how Madison had alienated Great Britain from the U.S. politically. And incredibly, he seemed to be talking openly about this, undermining his boss and the President of the United States. In what almost seems like a treasonous move, in hindsight, he even told the British diplomat, a guy named Philip Morier, that while Madison announced that Napoleon repealed his decrees, Smith didn't actually think that was the case. Smith then went on to sympathize with Morier, and even said that Britain should be upset with how this was all being handled, and they had a right to complain. This is the Secretary of State of the United States of America when his own country is on the freaking brink of war with the diplomat's home country. When you're a member of the presidential cabinet, it's one thing to disagree with the president or the administration's policies, but it is far worse to not only voice your displeasure to foreign adversaries, but also debunk your own administration's claims at the same time. When Madison received word of Smith's defiance, he was frustrated, to say the least. And that is because, politically, it was a more difficult situation than it seemed on the surface. As I mentioned earlier, Robert Smith had a brother named Samuel, who was a powerful and influential senator, and one of the likely reasons that Robert got the job as Secretary of State in the first place. Samuel Smith, Senator Samuel Smith, had prevented the Jefferson and Madison Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, from getting the Secretary of State job. Remember, he was Madison's first choice, and had since gone head-to-head, and Gallatin had since gone head-to-head with Samuel Smith in a political battle halting the renewal of the National Bank, which expired in 1811. But that wasn't the only thing that Gallatin and Senator Smith had been at odds about. They had been in a personal and political feud for years, and their families couldn't stand each other. After willingly continuing to serve as Madison's Secretary of Treasury for the last couple years, Albert Gallatin was fed up. He informed Madison that he stayed on because of how much he admired Madison, but he was no longer willing to continue in his role. Gallatin wrote to Madison, making it clear that he did not approve of Robert Smith or the influence his brother held in the Senate. Gallatin said, quote, "New subdivisions and personal factions equally hostile to yourself and the general welfare daily require additional strength. The consequences were extensive and fatal. Either he or Smith would have to go." Gallatin had given Madison an ultimatum, and he was fully prepared to walk away. Madison could have none of that. He loved Gallatin and needed Gallatin. On April 1st, 1809, 2 years into his presidency, Madison decided to fire Robert Smith. Madison informed him that both his language and conduct outside of the office was unacceptable and not aligned with his administration. Smith argued that this wasn't the case, but Madison stood firm. And this was likely extremely difficult for Madison, as he was friends with Smith, and many of Smith's good friends were Madison's good friends, Thomas Jefferson included. And for a guy that hated conflict and wasn't physically or verbally an imposing figure, this conversation must have been an excruciating one for President Madison. And he admitted as much, writing that this conundrum about Smith had, quote, harassed his feelings in a degree equal by no occurrence in my long political life. But Smith kept demanding to know who spoke against him and refused to accept the reality of the dismissal. Eventually, Madison just had to cut to the chase. He told Smith that he just couldn't do the job. He made Madison's life and job more difficult, and Madison could no longer put up with it. Madison was ready to move on, and he already knew who he was going to nominate next. Madison's bumbling mistakes had made him look weak and unsure. He needed someone with name recognition. He needed someone with a reputation of getting things done. He needed someone that the people in other nations had confidence in that could get the job done. Madison had a bad feeling that the nation may be heading toward war, and he needed to ensure that he had all hands on deck. He knew exactly who he was going to choose. The man who ran against him for the presidency, the very office he was currently sitting in. James Monroe. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider just how challenging the responsibilities of the presidency was, and in a lot of ways still is. Foreign diplomacy was incredibly complicated. Letters were sent back and forth across an ocean. Ambassadors were tasked with negotiating on behalf of leaders whom they weren't in regular contact with. Monarchs in Europe were calling the shots, sometimes not knowing exactly where they were aiming. Madison was in over his head at times during the first couple years of these negotiations, but hopefully after today's episode you have a better understanding of just how complicated these things were. Madison made a lot of mistakes, but when looking at them in retrospect you can understand why. There was no magic bullet to navigating these rough political waters. The U.S. was still an infant nation, negotiating with world powers without the support of an effective army or navy. They were founded on Republican principles with values and a mission that empowered people and provided freedom. Meanwhile, they were negotiating with nations like Britain and France who were far more interested in maintaining power and control. Citizen empowerment be damned. Madison was just as imperfect as the rest of them. A man dedicated to his nation, trying to do whatever he could to put his people and party in the best possible situation. Next week, we'll talk about how he comes to find out that it's a hell of a lot easier said than done as the U.S. inches closer and closer to a war with Britain that they so desperately wanted to avoid. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.